the opulent silence of Serafino's, a Manhattan establishment where backroom deals were sealed and blood money was toasted with vintage champagne, shattered with the whip crack of a slap. It wasn't a dispute over a bill or a petty disagreement. It was the fiancée of the most ruthless mafia boss on the East Coast, Serena Ashford, delivering a stinging blow to a young waitress named Vivian Holloway. Serena was a woman known for her glacial composure, her emotions locked away like weapons in a vault. So what drove her to public violence over a tiny smear of olive oil? The entire room froze. The suited sharks mid-negotiation, the terrified staff clutching their trays, the sommelier with a bottle of $10,000 wine suspended in air. But what happened in the next 90 seconds, the waitress's impossible, silent response, would make the most feared man in the room, Alexander the Silence Moretti, drop his 50-year-old Macallan whiskey glass for the first time in 15 years, and realize the real danger wasn't the woman who just swung her hand, but the exhausted 27-year-old waitress who had been working 3 jobs to pay for her dying brother's heart surgery, who hadn't slept more than 4 hours in 2 years, who had already lost everything except her pride, and who just took the hit without flinching. You think you know this story? You have no idea. If this satisfies your love for intense storytelling, hit like to let me know. Share it with someone who lives for dramatic twists. And subscribe for part 2, where secrets unravel and loyalties shatter. Because what Vivian Holloway did next didn't just shock the restaurant. It changed the entire power structure of the New York underworld. The air inside Serafino's was thick as hardened honey, the sound of the slap still echoing against the dark oak-paneled walls, slipping through every fold of the crimson velvet curtains, brushing the ears of everyone, pretending they had heard nothing at all. No one dared to move. A sous chef stood frozen behind a kitchen door left slightly ajar, a soup ladle still clutched in his hand, broth dripping onto the marble floor without his awareness. A young waitress stood 3 steps away, her drink tray trembling, the cocktail glasses quivering as if they too were afraid. Theodore Grant, the 55-year-old manager with silver-white hair and eyes that had witnessed far too many horrors within these walls, stood petrified behind the host's stand, his face drained of color, the wrinkles etched into it like fine cracks in porcelain. In the corner of the room, a group of businessmen in tailored 3-piece suits fell silent in the middle of a multi-million-dollar negotiation, expensive pens hovering above documents, no one daring to sign, no one daring to breathe too loudly. Yet all of those eyes, no matter how deliberately they looked away, were secretly watching one man. Alexander Moretti sat motionless in the VIP booth, the golden glow of a Murano chandelier above him casting light across his face like a sunset before a storm. He did not move. Not a single muscle in that sculpted face shifted. His storm-gray eyes were fixed on the scene before him, unreadable, revealing nothing of his thoughts. A glass of 50-year-old Macallan whiskey remained in his hand, long, elegant fingers wrapped around it as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. Serena Ashford still stood there, her right hand suspended in the air after the slap, slender fingers adorned with a 12-carat diamond engagement ring that glittered under the lights like a cruel mockery. She was waiting for tears, waiting for pleas, waiting for the small waitress to collapse to her knees and beg for forgiveness, just like everyone else had before her. Serena's lips curved into a smile as thin as a blade, a cold, vicious satisfaction radiating from her pale blue eyes. This was her favorite moment. The moment when the week finally broke, but Vivian Holloway did not break. She stood there, her left cheek burning red as if scorched by fire, a few strands of brown hair clinging to the corner of her mouth where a thin line of blood seeped from a bitten lip. Her eyes closed, not from pain, not from fear, but as if she were counting. 1, 2, 3. Her chest rose with a deep, measured breath, slow and controlled. And when her eyes opened, what Serena Ashford saw was not the submission she had expected. It was something else entirely. Something that made the smile on her lips freeze in place. Something that caused even Alexander Moretti, a man who had faced death hundreds of times without flinching, to tighten his grip around the whiskey glass until his knuckles turned white. Because in the eyes of that 27-year-old waitress there were no tears, no fear, no surrender, only a terrifying calm so profound it seemed to drain the very air from the room. Vivian Holloway moved, slowly, deliberately, every motion calculated down to the smallest measure, as though she were performing a sacred ritual that only she understood. Her right hand rose, not to touch the burning cheek, not to wipe the blood at the corner of her mouth, but to slip into the breast pocket of her white shirt. Her slender fingers, roughened by years of work, found something neatly folded inside. She drew out a handkerchief. Not the cheap paper kind the restaurant handed out to its staff. Not an ordinary scrap of fabric belonging to a waitress who lived tip to tip, but a pristine white linen handkerchief, edged with delicate handmade lace, its corner embroidered with 2 intertwined initials in silver thread dulled slightly by time. It was her mother's last keepsake, the only thing left of a woman who had died in a hospital bed 11 years earlier, her hand clasping that of a 16-year-old girl, as she whispered that life was meant to be lived fully. Serena Ashford stared at the handkerchief, her brows knitting in confusion, wondering what was coming next. A pitiful apology, perhaps, or a gesture to dab away tears, but Vivian did neither. Instead, she stepped forward, one step, then another, the distance between her and the woman who had struck her, shrinking. Theodore Grant caught his breath. A nearby waitress nearly dropped her tray. Someone among the businessmen murmured a prayer. Serena instinctively stepped back half a pace, for the first time something other than contempt flickering in her eyes, perhaps unease, perhaps a trace of fear she would never admit. Vivian stopped directly in front of her, close enough to catch the scent of expensive Chanel No. 5, close enough to see every grain of powder on the flawless skin of the powerful fiancé. And then, without a word, she raised the linen handkerchief and gently dabbed at a faint smear of olive oil on Serena's shoulder, a tiny mark, nearly invisible, the spark that had ignited everything. She wiped it away slowly, softly, with the care one might show a sleeping child. There was no anger in the gesture, no mockery, no submission, only a pure calm so absolute it became a declaration. Serena stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, unable to react, because this was not the scene she had imagined, not how this was supposed to unfold. She was Serena Ashford, the woman who made an entire city tremble, who had struck an insignificant waitress, and that girl was now cleaning her blouse, as if Serena were the one in need of care, a humiliation far worse than any slap in return. When the stain was gone, Vivian folded the handkerchief neatly, just as before, and slipped it back into her pocket. She stepped back once, her dark brown eyes meeting Serena's gaze, not in challenge, not in provocation, but in emptiness, as if Serena Ashford and her blow were not worth a single tear or a single reply. Silence fell, so heavy the room seemed to sink beneath it, the sound of candles burning on the tables, champagne fizzing in glasses, the hearts of dozens of people pounding as they held their breath. Serena opened her mouth to speak, to hurl an insult, a threat, anything to reclaim control, but before she could form a single syllable, another sound cut through the stillness, the sharp crash of shattering glass. The 50-year-old Macallan whiskey glass slipped from Alexander Moretti's hand, as if his fingers had suddenly forgotten how to hold, the Waterford crystal striking the marble tabletop first, bouncing once, then crashing to the restaurant floor where it shattered into hundreds of glittering shards beneath the chandelier's light. The sound of exploding glass rang out like a gunshot in a graveyard, tearing through the silence that had smothered Serafino's. Amber whiskey spread across the white stone tiles, pooling like diluted blood. It was a glass worth $3,000, but no one cared about the money, because Alexander the Silence Moretti never dropped anything. In 15 years of ruling the largest underworld empire on the East Coast, this was a man who had watched executions carried out in front of him without blinking, who had signed death orders without a tremor in his hand, who had faced the barrels of enemy guns and merely smiled. The nickname The Silence came not only from how little he spoke, but from the absolute control he exerted over every muscle, every expression, every involuntary reaction of his body. And yet now a glass had fallen from his grasp, in front of the entire restaurant, in front of partners waiting to sign contracts, in front of his fiancée, because of a waitress. Theodore Grant felt his knees threaten to give way, because in 22 years of managing Serafino's, he had never seen anything like this. He had witnessed deals sealed behind closed doors, had scrubbed blood from carpets without asking questions, but he had never seen Alexander Moretti lose control for even a heartbeat. Serena Ashford spun toward her fiancé, and for the first time that night something other than arrogance crossed her face. Confusion, then concern, then a flicker of fear deep in her pale blue eyes, because she knew Alexander better than anyone. She knew the weight of that glass in his hand. She knew he valued control above every possession he owned, and she knew that if he had dropped it, something had reached him, something powerful enough to fracture the steel wall he had built since the day his father died. Serena's gaze slid back to Vivian Holloway, the waitress still standing there with a face as emotionless as carved stone, and suddenly she saw what she had missed from the beginning. She had struck a woman, But that woman had not fallen, had not begged, had not fled. She had stood upright, wiped away the humiliation, and met the eyes of the person who had demeaned her without uttering a single word. And that act, that proud silence, had made the most powerful man in the room drop his glass. Serena Ashford understood a terrifying truth in that moment. She was not the one in control of this situation. She never had been. And when Alexander Moretti slowly rose from the VIP booth, his height of 1.85 meters, seeming to fill the entire room, Serena knew that everything was about to change. She simply did not yet know how disastrous that change would be for her. Alexander Moretti stepped out of the VIP booth, each footfall striking the marble floor like the beat of a war drum, and no one dared to meet his gaze, as the most powerful guests in Manhattan suddenly lowered their eyes to their plates, as though nothing in the world were more fascinating. While the staff retreated to the walls, shrinking themselves into shadows, trying to become invisible, and only Vivian Holloway remained where she was, not stepping back, even though she did not look directly at the man advancing toward them. Serena turned to face her fiancé, her lips already curving into a practiced, seductive smile, her blue eyes flickering as if she had just done something worthy of praise, and she said sweetly, like honey dripping from her tongue, that she was sorry for the interruption, that the little waitress had been disrespectful and ruined her new Valentino blouse, that she had merely been teaching her a lesson in manners. Alexander stopped 2 steps away from her, did not look at Vivian, and instead fixed his gaze on his fiancée. And what Serena saw in those gray eyes was not agreement or understanding but ice, pure and absolute. And when he spoke, his voice was so low it was nearly a whisper, yet it rolled through the room like distant thunder, reminding her that this had happened in his restaurant, in front of his guests, over a smear of olive oil barely visible to the naked eye. Serena blinked as the smile on her lips began to fracture, because she had never heard him use this tone with her before. Only with enemies, only with traitors, and she stumbled as she replied that she had only been trying to preserve their family's dignity, that the girl had touched her without permission and needed to know her place. Dignity, Alexander repeated, as if the word tasted bitter, telling her that she had struck a defenseless woman in front of 50 people, turned his restaurant into a stage for her personal rage, and called that dignity. And Serena took a step back, her Louboutin heel catching on the floor, insisting with a growing desperation in her voice that the girl had ruined her blouse, a $15,000 blouse. Alexander stepped forward, closing the distance, forcing her to tilt her head up to meet his eyes, and told her that he could buy her 100 such blouses without a thought, but that there was something he could not buy back: respect, because when she behaved like someone without control in public, she did not only embarrass herself, she embarrassed him, showing the world that the fiancé of Alexander Moretti lacked the self-command to deal with a minor accident without resorting to violence. Tears began to glisten at the corners of Serena's eyes, but no one in the room believed they were real, not after she had used them so many times, and she whispered that she was truly sorry as she reached out to touch his arm, only for him to step back and avoid the contact, a rejection that struck harder than the slap she had delivered to Vivian. "Nikolai," Alexander said, not needing to turn to know where his bodyguard stood, and a man of 30 years, with closely cropped blonde hair and eyes cold as steel, emerged from the shadows near the entrance, and Alexander ordered him to take Miss Ashford home, his voice empty of emotion, saying she was tired, she needed rest, and she would not be returning tonight. Serena opened her mouth to protest, but the look in Nikolai's eyes silenced her, and she glanced around at the faces, pretending not to watch. At Theodore frozen behind the host stand, at the powerful guests witnessing her humiliation, because for the first time in 12 years, since she had entered New York's shadowed upper world, Serena Ashford was being treated like a misbehaving child sent back to her room, and as Nikolai placed a firm but gentle hand on her elbow and guided her toward the door, she looked back at Vivian Holloway one last time, and in those pale blue eyes seething with hatred, there was a silent vow that this was not over, that it was only the beginning. The restaurant door had barely closed behind Serena when Alexander Moretti turned to Theodore Grant and told him to clear away the broken glass and escort Miss Holloway to the private room in the back, his voice calm, almost casual, as if he were asking for a glass of water rather than having just humiliated his fiancée in front of Manhattan's elite. Theodore swallowed hard, his throat dry and bitter as sand, because in 22 years at Serafino's he had taken orders from dangerous men, but never once had he felt fear like this. "Yes, Mr. Moretti," he stammered, then turned to Vivian with a look caught somewhere between pity and dread, and told her to follow him. Vivian did not move at once. She remained still for one more breath, her dark brown eyes sweeping the room one final time as if memorizing every face, every corner, every pool of light, because this might be the last time she ever walked through this restaurant as an employee, or it might be the last time she ever walked out of it whole, and she did not know which. But she followed Theodore anyway, because not following was never an option. They passed through the kitchen, where the chef stood frozen with knives in hand, eyes fixed straight ahead, afraid to glance sideways. They moved down the narrow corridor leading to the staff area, where rows of personal lockers lined the wall like upright graves. At last they stopped before a black oak door with no nameplate, no number, no sign to suggest what lay beyond it. "Wait here," Theodore said quietly, his voice trembling as if he were the one awaiting judgment. "I will announce you." Vivian nodded without speaking, and when Theodore disappeared behind the door, she stood alone in the dim hallway, her back against the cool wall, and for the first time that night she allowed herself to feel her cheeks still burned. The metallic taste of blood lingered on her tongue from her bitten lip. Her heart was pounding so fast she could hear it in her ears, a wild drumbeat she had not let show on the surface. She thought of Marcus lying on the old sofa in their Bronx apartment, his chest rising with difficulty at each breath. She thought of Lily folding clothes to sell online, her small fingers roughened by needles and thread. She thought of the $250,000 she had no idea how to find for the surgery, and now she might be losing her job, or worse, losing her life. The door opened. Theodore stepped out, his face even paler than before, as if he had just seen the devil and been spared to carry the message. "Mr. Moretti will see you," he said. "He is alone." Alone. The word echoed in Vivian's mind like a death bell. No witnesses meant no one would know if she disappeared. No one would tell the story if she never walked out of that room. But Vivian Holloway had lived 27 years in a world without choices. She had faced landlords pounding on the door at midnight. She had faced cold doctors announcing impossible sums. She had faced the deaths of her parents at 16. A mafia boss in a closed room was not more frightening than what life had already thrown at her. She drew in a deep breath, smoothed her rumpled apron, and stepped through the black oak door. The room inside was darker than she had imagined, lit only by a single table lamp illuminating the corner where Alexander Moretti sat, a fresh glass of whiskey in his hand, storm-gray eyes waiting for her. The door clicked shut behind Vivian with a soft sound like a vault locking into place, and the room was smaller than she had expected, furnished in a minimalist style with dark walnut wood and cognac-colored leather, no windows, no second exit, only Alexander Moretti seated behind a small desk, a single desk lamp illuminating half of his face while the other half remained swallowed by shadow, creating an image that was half man and half demon, unsettling to the core. "Sit down," he ordered, his voice flat, and even as his head tilted slightly toward the leather chair across from him. Vivian did not move at once. She stood for a single beat, her eyes sweeping the room out of habit, the reflex of someone accustomed to searching for exits, before stepping forward and sitting. She kept her back straight, her hands resting on her thighs, neither submissive nor defiant. Alexander studied her in silence for 30 seconds, his gray eyes traveling from her slightly disheveled brown hair down to the rumpled white shirt, pausing on the bruise blooming into purple along her left cheek. "You did not cry," he said, a statement rather than a question. Vivian met his gaze without flinching. "No, sir." "Why?" "Because tears do not pay rent," Vivian replied, her voice strangely calm. "Tears do not pay hospital bills. Tears do not buy medicine. I cried enough when I was 16, cried until there was nothing left to cry. Now all I do is work." Alexander leaned forward slightly, the interest in his eyes shifting from curiosity to something deeper. "The handkerchief," he said. "Italian linen, hand-embroidered, at least 20 years old, not something a waitress usually carries in her pocket." Vivian's hand lifted instinctively to her breast pocket, where the handkerchief rested. "My mother's," she said, and for the first time that night her voice cracked, a brief fracture of emotion she could not fully hide. "She died when I was 16. Cancer. This is the only thing I have left of her. The only thing. Our house was seized to pay medical debt. Everything else was sold. I kept this because it was in my pocket during the funeral." Alexander leaned back, his eyes narrowing as if seeing Vivian under an entirely different light. "And you used the most precious thing you own to clean the blouse of the woman who struck you. Why?" Vivian was silent for a moment, weighing her answer. Then she spoke slowly, each word chosen with care. "Because it was the only way to show her that she could not reach me. She could slap me. She could humiliate me. But she could not make me small. I wiped away the oil because it was my job. because I am good at my job, and because I do not need to lower myself to answer someone who has already lowered themselves by their own actions." The room fell into silence. Alexander Moretti, a man who had heard countless pleas, justifications, and lies from the most powerful people in the city, found himself for the first time in a very long while without words. This 27-year-old waitress was not begging for her life, not asking to keep her job, not trying to flatter him or blame anyone else. She was simply telling the truth, bare and sharp as a honed blade. "Do you have siblings, Miss Holloway?" Alexander asked, the question seeming to come from nowhere. "Two," Vivian answered, not asking how he knew, because she understood that a man like Alexander Moretti knew everything about everyone within his reach. "My brother is 17, born with a heart condition, needs surgery within 3 months. My sister is 13, still in middle school. I am the only one earning money, 3 jobs." Vivian nodded. "Waiting tables here at night, cleaning offices early in the morning, selling goods online during the day." Alexander's gaze lingered on the deep shadows beneath her eyes, on the calloused fingers, on shoulders subtly hunched from chronic exhaustion she could not entirely conceal. "How many hours do you sleep each day?" 3 to 4, Vivian replied evenly. "When I am lucky." Alexander set his whiskey glass down on the desk, the sound of crystal meeting wood dry and sharp in the stillness. He stood, walked around the desk, and stopped directly in front of her. Vivian lifted her head to look at him, did not stand, did not retreat, only held his gaze with unblinking dark brown eyes. "You keep your job," Alexander said. "Your salary doubles starting tonight. No one in this restaurant is permitted to touch you. If anyone gives you trouble, guest or staff, you report directly to Theodore, and Theodore reports to me." Vivian did not thank him. She only nodded once, accepting it as if it were a matter of fact rather than a favor. And that reaction, the absence of groveling gratitude he was so accustomed to receiving, made Alexander Moretti smile for the first time that night. A thin, fleeting smile like a cloud passing over the moon, but a real one. "Interesting," he murmured, his voice so soft Vivian was not sure she had heard it correctly. "Very interesting." Vivian stepped off the subway platform in the Bronx at 2 in the morning, her legs aching to the bone after a 12-hour shift, the stairway leading up to the street damp and reeking of urine, flickering fluorescent lights threatening to die at any moment, a few hunched figures lingering in dark corners she had long ago learned not to see. And the neighborhood at night was never truly quiet. Ambulance sirens wailing in the distance, dogs barking from an apartment below, the sound of someone arguing on a balcony across the street. This was her home, not because she had chosen it, but because it was all she could afford to have. The apartment sat on the 5th floor of a red brick building built in the 1960s. The elevator broken for 3 years and never repaired, and Vivian climbed the stairs one step at a time with legs like lead, gripping the rusted railing as her labored breathing echoed through the dark stairwell. When she opened the apartment door, the smell of antibiotics and damp mold struck her like a second slap that night. The one-bedroom space, so cramped that 3 people living there felt like fish trapped in a tank far too small. Marcus lay on the battered old sofa in the corner, a thin blanket pulled over him that was never warm enough, his chest rising and falling with effort at each breath, his face so pale it seemed almost translucent under the streetlight filtering through the window. Blue veins standing out sharply at his temples, his lips parted just enough to draw in each precious mouthful of air, as if oxygen itself were a luxury. 17 years old, yet looking like an old man waiting to die. Vivian crossed the room quietly, bent down to pull the blanket higher over her brother, her hand touching his forehead to check his temperature. Warm, no fever. Tonight was a good night, and she exhaled in relief, even though she knew every good night was only a delay for worse ones waiting ahead. "You are home." Her sister's soft voice came from the corner of the room, making Vivian turn. Lily sat on the floor beside the only working outlet, an old laptop open in front of her, the blue glow of the screen lighting the face of a 13-year-old child with eyes far too old for her age, saying she was doing schoolwork and trying not to turn on the light so Marcus could sleep. Vivian felt her heart constrict. 13 years old, and Lily already knew how to live in the dark to save on electricity, how to speak in whispers so as not to disturb a sick brother, how to ask for nothing because she knew her sister carried too much already, when she should have been coming home from school to watch television, snack, and argue with friends on the phone like other children her age. Instead, sitting here in a damp apartment doing homework by laptop light because she did not dare turn on a lamp. "Have you eaten?" Vivian asked gently, though her throat was tight. "Yes," Lily answered, saying she had eaten instant noodles at 7 in the evening, her smile so bright it felt almost forced, adding that she had saved one packet in the kitchen for her sister. Vivian nodded and stepped into the tiny kitchen corner separated from the living space by a cloth curtain, opened the cupboard, and saw the lone packet of noodles on an empty shelf, beside an almost finished bottle of fish sauce and a container of salt. The refrigerator bare. 3 months of unpaid rent, Marcus's hospital bills piled on the table like a mountain of paper, and the $250,000 surgery hanging overhead like a blade waiting to fall. Vivian leaned back against the kitchen wall, closed her eyes, and for the first time that night allowed her body to tremble. Because in the restaurant, she had stood firm like stone. Before Serena Ashford, she had not shed a single tear. Before Alexander Moretti, she had spoken as if addressing an ordinary man rather than the most dangerous mafia boss on the East Coast. But here, in this dark, mold-scented kitchen, she was only Vivian Holloway, a 27-year-old woman drowning in her own life. She lifted her hand to her cheek where the bruise throbbed and whispered into the darkness, "What am I supposed to do now? Mom, I do not know what to do anymore." And there was no answer, only Marcus's labored breathing, Lily's soft keystrokes, and the distant wail of ambulance sirens echoing through the night, like a reminder that death was waiting just beyond the door. At the same time, on the other side of Manhattan, inside a luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park, Serena Ashford was shattering a baccarat crystal collection worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Each glass, each vase, each exquisitely crafted ornament hurled against the cream-colored walls and exploding into thousands of glittering shards. She screamed, a scream fueled by pure hatred that echoed through the vast space, unheard by anyone because she had sent every servant away the moment Nikolai dropped her at the door. The humiliation of the night burned in her chest like acid. Alexander had reprimanded her in front of the entire restaurant, in front of business partners, in front of lowly waitstaff, and all of it because of whom? Because of a worthless little server, a girl with nothing to her name except defiant eyes and an infuriating calm. Serena stopped amid the wreckage, her chest heaving, platinum blonde hair spilling loose from its perfect updo, pale blue eyes blazing with fury. She looked down at the 12-carat engagement ring on her finger, the diamond glittering beneath the chandelier like a cruel taunt. 12 carats, a symbol of power, a symbol of her position beside the most powerful man in New York, and now everything was trembling because of a waitress. Serena stepped through the broken glass without caring that shards were slicing into the soles of her heels, and retrieved a second phone from a hidden drawer in her wardrobe. Not the phone Alexander knew about, but a burner she had kept concealed for 6 months. She dialed the only number stored and waited. 1 ring, 2. Then a rough male voice came through the line, amused and lazy, saying that calling so late must mean something important, or perhaps she missed him. Vincent Castellano, the mafia boss who controlled southern Manhattan and the sworn enemy of the Moretti family. Serena clenched her teeth and swallowed her rage at his condescension, because for 6 months she had endured Vincent's leering disrespect in exchange for promises of real power, the kind Alexander had never truly given her despite 3 years of engagement. "The plan has changed," she said, her voice cold as steel. "I need to move sooner than planned." Vincent fell silent for a moment, and Serena could almost picture the predatory smile spreading across his scarred face. "What happened?" he asked. "Did your perfect fiancé hurt you?" "Do not mock me, Castellano," Serena snarled. "I have fed you information on Moretti's transport routes for 6 months. Every secret meeting, every new partner, every weakness in his system. Now I want action, and I want the waitress at Serafino's to pay." The silence stretched, then Vincent spoke again, his tone sharpening. "Which waitress?" "Vivian Holloway." Serena spat the name as if it were bitter on her tongue. "She dared to humiliate me tonight," and Alexander took her side. "I want her gone, and I want to use her as bait to draw Alexander into a trap." Vincent laughed aloud, a low rumbling sound crackling through the line. "Oh, Serena, you always know how to make things interesting." "Very well, I am listening. Tell me about this waitress, and we will discuss how to turn her into a piece on the board in the game to bring down Alexander Moretti." 3 days passed like a strange dream that Vivian could not quite tell was real or imagined, and at Serafino's everything had changed in ways that were subtle yet unmistakable. No one daring to look at her for too long, no one assigning her the heaviest tasks, Theodore Grant treating her with the same blend of respect and unease he reserved for the most powerful guests, her doubled salary appearing in her account exactly as promised, And for the first time in 2 years, Vivian was able to buy fresh meat to cook for Marcus and Lily, instead of surviving on endless instant noodles. Yet she knew there was no such thing as a free meal in this world. The call came at 3 in the afternoon on the third day, as she was preparing for her evening shift. An unfamiliar number but a familiar voice telling her that a car was waiting downstairs and Mr. Moretti expected to see her at Moretti Tower within 1 hour, the line going dead before she could say a word. Vivian looked down at what she was wearing, an old t-shirt and faded jeans, then at Marcus asleep on the sofa, and she knew she had neither time to change nor the option to refuse. 20 minutes later, she was sitting in a sleek black Mercedes Maybach gliding through Manhattan streets she had only ever seen through subway windows, the driver silent the entire way. Moretti Tower rose in the financial district like a monument of glass and steel, 70 stories high, reflecting the gray New York sky like a colossal mirror. And Vivian crossed a lobby paved in black marble, past security guards in black suits with discreet earpieces, and was escorted into a private elevator that carried her straight to the top. When the doors opened, she stepped into a space that felt like another world. Polished walnut floors, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing all of Manhattan, abstract paintings worth millions on the walls, and at the center of it all, Alexander Moretti stood with his back to her, gazing out as though surveying a kingdom that belonged to him. "Miss Holloway," he said without turning, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Thank you for coming." Vivian walked forward, her worn sneakers sounding painfully out of place on the expensive floor. "I did not think I had the option not to come, Mr. Moretti." Alexander turned, a thin smile flickering briefly at her honesty. Dressed in a charcoal 3-piece suit, with a white shirt and no tie, looking more like a Fortune 500 executive than the most notorious Mafia boss on the East Coast, though his gray eyes remained cold as steel and sharp as blades. "You are intelligent," he observed, "and that is why I wanted to speak with you." He moved to the massive ebony desk and sat, gesturing for Vivian to take the chair opposite, and she did, back straight, hands on her thighs, waiting. "I have a job for you," Alexander said without preamble. "A dangerous job, but well paid." Vivian said nothing, only watched him. "I need a courier," he continued, his gaze never leaving her. "Someone outside the organization, unknown, unsuspected. You will carry a briefcase to a location, hand it to a person I designate, then leave. Do not open it. Do not ask questions. Do not tell anyone." "Sounds simple," Vivian said evenly. "But if it were simple, you would not need me." "Correct." Alexander nodded, and she could swear she saw a flicker of respect in his eyes. "The man you will meet is Raymond Cross, an arms broker. This meeting is a test of his loyalty. You will deliver the message and observe his reaction. If everything goes smoothly, you go home and your life continues as before. And if it does not go smoothly, if it does not, Nikolai will be nearby to ensure your safety," Alexander replied. "But I will not lie to you and say there is no risk. There is, and that risk is why I am prepared to pay you $300,000. Vivian's heart seemed to miss a beat. $300,000, enough to pay for Marcus's surgery, enough to clear the rent debt, enough for Lily to have a proper desk and new books, enough for one night of sleep without fearing tomorrow. "I see you trembling," Alexander noted, his gaze sharp as a hawk's. Vivian looked down and saw that her fingers were indeed shaking, and she did not hide it. "I have a brother who needs heart surgery within 3 months, she said plainly. "The cost is $250,000. I am not shaking from fear. I am shaking because this is the first time I can see a way to save him." Alexander studied her in silence, and when he spoke, his voice carried a slightly different tone, softer though still distant. "You have 24 hours to decide," he said. "If you accept, return here at this time tomorrow. If you refuse, you keep your job at Serafino's and we forget this conversation ever happened. I do not make this offer twice." Vivian stood, nodded politely without deference, and walked toward the elevator, stopping with her hand on the call button. "Mr. Moretti," she turned back, "if I die on this job, who will take care of my brother?" Alexander looked at her, and for the first time something other than cold calculation crossed his gray eyes, a flicker of curiosity, a measure of respect, perhaps even a trace of compassion he would never admit. "If you die, that will be my failure," he said, "and I do not accept failure." The elevator doors closed, and Vivian stepped inside carrying a question heavy in her chest, one she had already answered long before she had asked it. That night Vivian did not sleep. She sat on the cold floor beside the sofa where Marcus lay, her back against the wall, knees drawn to her chest, listening to her brother's breathing in the darkness each breath a battle, a heavy inhale, a rasping exhale, then a terrifying pause before the cycle began again. And sometimes that pause stretched so long that Vivian found herself holding her own breath, her heart hammering in her chest until she heard the next fragile intake of air. She remembered the appointment with Dr. Chen 2 weeks earlier, in a small examination room lit by harsh fluorescent lights, cardiovascular posters lining the walls. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair and sorrowful eyes behind thick glasses, telling her gently that Marcus's condition was deteriorating faster than expected, that his heart valve was failing severely, that without surgery within 3 months, his heart would not hold, and that she was sorry, words that had cut Vivian open like blades. $250,000. The number had haunted her every night since, like a monster crouched in the dark waiting to devour what little hope she had left. She had calculated every possible option. Selling a kidney might bring $20,000 if she was lucky, and she needed both kidneys to keep working and supporting her siblings. Banks would not lend such a sum to a waitress with no collateral. Charities had waiting lists stretching into years. She had even considered selling her body, but even that could not raise enough money in 3 months. And now, in the middle of all that desperation, Alexander Moretti had appeared with $300,000 and a dangerous job. Vivian looked toward the corner where Lily slept on a thin mattress on the floor, an old blanket wrapped around her like a cocoon. 13 years old. Her sister was only 13, and if Vivian died, who would take care of Lily? Who would make sure she stayed in school, ate properly, grew up like a normal child? But if Vivian did nothing, Marcus would die. And if Marcus died, a part of Vivian would die with him. She had lost her father. She had lost her mother. She could not lose her brother, too. She lifted her hand to her breast pocket, where her mother's linen handkerchief rested like a silent reminder. Her mother had fought until her last breath, clinging to life by every means possible, not because she feared death, but because she did not want to leave her children behind. And now Vivian had to fight as well, by any means necessary. Outside the window, the sky began to fade from black to gray, signaling the coming dawn. And Vivian rose, moved softly through the room so as not to wake her siblings, took the old phone from the table, and typed a brief message to the number that had called her the previous afternoon. "I agree." She pressed send, and in that moment Vivian Holloway knew she had stepped through a door from which there was no turning back, and she could only hope that what lay on the other side was not hell. Nikolai Volkov was not the kind of man who talked much, and over 3 days of training in a hidden basement beneath Moretti Tower, Vivian could count on one hand the number of full sentences he spoke to her, but what he taught her she would never forget. On the first day, he led her into an empty room with gray concrete walls and black rubber flooring, tossed her a bottle of water, and said only one word: "Observe." She did not understand what he meant until he made her sit in the corner and stare through a one-way glass window overlooking the main lobby of Moretti Tower for 3 full hours, after which he asked her how many people had passed through, how many wore blue suits, how many looked at their phones while walking, how many carried concealed weapons. Vivian answered with more than 80% accuracy, and for the first time she saw Nikolai raise an eyebrow slightly, the closest thing to approval he was capable of showing. "Where did you grow up?" he asked. "The Bronx," Vivian replied. "South Bronx. When you walk home after midnight, if you do not observe, you do not live until morning." Nikolai nodded, as if that explained everything. On the second day, he taught her how to spot a tail. They walked through crowded Manhattan streets while Nikolai pointed out signs ordinary people never noticed. A man whose shoes were too new for his worn clothes, a woman reading a newspaper whose eyes never moved across the page, a car parked too long with the driver still inside, tiny details that could be lethal. "You learn fast," Nikolai said at the end of the day, and it was the longest compliment he gave her. On the third day, he taught her how to stay calm under threat. Without warning, he drew his gun and aimed it directly at her face, and Vivian did not flinch. She simply looked at him with steady, dark brown eyes, as if the barrel were nothing more than a harmless plastic toy. "You are not afraid of death," Nikolai said, lowering the gun, his voice not a question. "I have been afraid of too many things in my life," Vivian answered calmly, as if discussing the weather. "Afraid of not having rent money. Afraid my brother would die before we could afford surgery. Afraid my sister would have to quit school. Death is just an ending. Those other things are a living hell." Nikolai studied her for a long moment, his steel blue eyes reassessing her from the beginning, then said something she had not expected. Mr. Moretti chose the right person. On the afternoon of the third day, Vivian was taken to another room to receive her official assignment, a black leather briefcase resting on the table beside an expensive gray business suit, high heels, and a small, elegant watch. "Tomorrow you will meet Raymond Cross at the St. Regis Hotel," Nikolai said. "Private Lancaster meeting room, second floor. You go in, deliver the case, observe his reaction, then leave. I will be nearby. If there is trouble, say Seaside and I will move in immediately." "Seaside," Vivian repeated, committing the code word to memory. "Understood." She looked down at the black briefcase and wondered what lay inside. A contract, money, or something far more dangerous. But she did not ask, because she had been told not to, and Vivian Holloway knew how to follow the rules when the lives of the people she loved depended on it. The street. Regis Hotel rose along Fifth Avenue like a European palace misplaced among Manhattan's towers of glass, and Vivian stepped through the polished brass revolving door, her heels tapping softly on the marble floor, the black leather briefcase gripped tightly in her right hand, the tailored gray suit fitting her as if custom-made, her hair neatly pinned at the nape of her neck, light makeup concealing the dark circles beneath her eyes, and the bruise on her cheek that had nearly faded, looking every bit the young businesswoman on her way to an important meeting, no one suspecting that only a week earlier she had been carrying plates in a restaurant and shaking over medical bills. The lobby glowed beneath a massive crystal chandelier suspended from the high ceiling, and Vivian scanned the space as Nikolai had taught her, counting guards, noting camera placements, mapping exits, 2 at the front door, 1 by the reception desk, 1 patrolling near the elevators. Nikolai nowhere in sight, but close enough she knew, perhaps in the cafe across the street, with an earpiece hidden beneath his collar. She climbed the broad staircase to the second floor where private meeting rooms housed conversations meant to be unseen. The Lancaster room at the end of the corridor, its oak door closed, unmarked, giving no hint of what waited inside. Vivian drew a deep breath, remembered Marcus's labored breathing the night before, and knocked 3 times as instructed. "Come in," a low male voice answered. She pushed the door open. The room was smaller than she expected, furnished in a classic style with emerald wallpaper and mahogany furniture, a round table at the center, and seated opposite was Raymond Cross, appearing around 50 years old with salt and pepper hair slicked back, a sharp face marked by a faint scar running from temple to jaw, his muddy brown eyes carrying the wary glint of a man who had lived too long in shadows to trust anyone. Dressed in a dark blue suit with a loosened tie, his right hand beneath the table in a way that told Vivian he was armed. "I bring a gift from Mr. Moretti," she said, her voice calm and clear, unshaken, as she placed the briefcase on the table and stepped back. Raymond Cross did not touch it. He studied her from head to toe, his gaze searching for weapons, recorders, signs of deception. "Moretti sends a girl to meet me," he said, his voice like gravel grinding together. "Strange. He usually sends Nikolai, or at least a man with a gun." "I am the courier, Mr. Cross," Vivian replied evenly. "My task is to deliver the case and leave. What you do with it afterward is not my concern." Raymond Cross watched her for several seconds, then suddenly rose and circled the table, his right hand no longer hidden, a black Beretta pistol gleaming in his grip as he aimed it directly at her, the barrel less than a step from her forehead. "Open the case," he ordered coldly. Vivian did not move. She looked at the gun, then into his eyes, and what he saw in her dark brown gaze made him hesitate. No fear, no panic, only a frozen calm like a lake sealed in ice. "I was instructed not to open it," she said steadily, as though the weapon were nothing more than a pen pointed her way. "You may open it yourself, but if you shoot me, Mr. Moretti will not be pleased, and I believe you know what happens when Mr. Moretti is displeased." Raymond Cross clenched his jaw, his finger tightening on the grip. "Who are you?" he growled. "Moretti never uses strangers for this kind of work. Are you testing me, or am I being played?" "I am only a courier, Mr. Cross," Vivian repeated, her voice unchanged, even as her heart thundered in her chest. "I do not know what is inside the case. I do not know what agreement you have with Mr. Moretti. I only know that if he wanted you dead, you would already be dead, without needing a girl like me to deliver a message." Silence stretched as Raymond Cross looked at her, then at the case, then back at her, weighing possibilities, calculating angles, searching for leverage, and then he laughed, a dry sound like autumn leaves scraping stone. "You have nerve, girl," he said, "but I do not trust this. I think you are bait. I think Moretti is testing me, and I do not like being tested." He cocked the gun, the click slicing through the quiet room like a death sentence. Vivian knew she should say the code word, Seaside, one word, and Nikolai would storm in. But something stubborn inside her, The same force that kept her from crying when Serena slapped her, the same pride that made her clean the blouse of the woman who humiliated her, compelled her to speak. "Mr. Cross, I have a 17-year-old brother waiting for heart surgery. I have a 13-year-old sister waiting for me to come home. If you kill me here, you will not only anger Mr. Moretti, you will kill 2 innocent children in the Bronx because I am the only one who supports them. Can you live with that?" Raymond Cross froze, staring at her, and for the first time something other than suspicion flickered in his eyes. Before he could react, the meeting room door burst open. Nikolai, stepping inside with his gun already drawn, aimed straight at Raymond Cross's head. "Put the gun down, Cross," Nikolai said icily. "You just failed the loyalty test. Mr. Moretti will contact you later to discuss the consequences." Raymond Cross lowered his weapon slowly, his gaze still fixed on Vivian with an expression he could not name, and as Nikolai escorted her out, his voice followed them. "This girl is dangerous, Moretti. She does not know fear, and those who do not know fear cannot be controlled." Nikolai said nothing, only placed a firm hand against Vivian's back and guided her toward the elevator. When the doors closed, he looked at her with an expression she could not decipher. "You did not call the code," he said. "I did not need to," Vivian answered, realizing her hands were trembling now, the delayed response of a body after danger had passed. "He would not shoot." "How did you know?" "Because he asked who I was, instead of pulling the trigger. People who intend to kill never ask questions." Nikolai was silent for a long moment, then spoke in a voice still cold but carrying a new undertone, almost respect. "This was not your first time facing danger." "No," Vivian replied softly, her eyes unfocused. "I grew up in the Bronx. Facing danger is how I survived." 2 weeks passed like a silent storm that swept Vivian into an entirely different world, and after the assignment with Raymond Cross, she was given 3 more missions, each more complex than the last, each one completed without a single mistake. The second mission required her to deliver a packet of documents to a politician at the Plaza Hotel, passing through 3 layers of security without being searched because she looked like nothing more than an ordinary office secretary. The third mission had her sitting in a cafe for 4 straight hours, observing and memorizing the routine of arrival, the number of bodyguards, habits, vulnerabilities. The fourth mission involved extracting information from a disgruntled female accountant, willing to sell her company's secrets, and Vivian guided the conversation so skillfully that she obtained everything she needed, without the woman ever suspecting a thing. After each assignment, Vivian was summoned to Moretti Tower to report directly to Alexander. At first, those meetings lasted no more than 10 minutes. He asked. She answered. He nodded. She left, but gradually they grew longer. 20 minutes, 30, an hour, and Alexander began asking her questions that went beyond the missions themselves. He asked what she thought of the accountant, what the woman's true motives were, whether she could be trusted. He asked for Vivian's opinion on the rival's schedule, on the weaknesses she had noticed, on how best to exploit them, and what surprised Vivian most was that he genuinely listened to her answers. One afternoon, after she completed the 4th mission, Alexander invited her to stay for tea instead of dismissing her as usual, and his office was filled with golden afternoon light overlooking Manhattan sinking into sunset, and for the first time Vivian realized that this room was not just his workplace but the place where he spent most of his time alone. "Do you know why I chose you, Holloway?" Alexander asked as he poured tea from an antique Chinese porcelain teapot into 2 small cups. "Because I have nothing to lose," Vivian answered honestly. "People with nothing to lose cannot be bought or threatened." "Wrong." Alexander handed her a cup, his gray eyes holding something almost warm despite the distance. "You have everything to lose. Your 2 siblings. That is why I know you will never betray me, not because you are loyal to me, but because you are loyal to them, and to protect them you would do anything." Vivian took a sip of tea, the bitter sweetness spreading across her tongue, and she realized he was telling the truth. She was not loyal to Alexander Moretti, she was only doing what was necessary to save Marcus and protect Lily. But did it matter when the outcome was the same? "Why do you trust me?" she asked in return. "You know nothing about me except that I am a poor waitress from the Bronx." "I know enough." Alexander leaned back in his chair, teacup in hand, his gaze drifting toward the window as if looking at something far away. "I know you were slapped and did not cry. I know you used the most precious thing you own to clean your enemy's blouse. I know you faced a gun without trembling. Those things tell me more than any file ever could." Silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people learning to understand one another without many words, and Vivian realized that over the past 2 weeks, Alexander had changed the way he treated her. No longer employer and employee, no longer mafia boss and waitress. He spoke to her as an equal, asked her opinion, listened to her, and sometimes, when he thought she was not looking, he looked at her with an expression she could not decipher. "I do not have many people I can trust," Alexander said suddenly, his voice lower and softer than usual. "In this world, trusting the wrong person means death, but trusting no one is another kind of death, slower but no less painful." "What do you call it?" Vivian asked quietly. "Loneliness," Alexander answered, still looking out the window, and in that moment he no longer looked like the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast. He was simply a 36-year-old man, wealthy, powerful, and completely alone. Vivian said nothing. She had no words to comfort a man like him, and she was not sure he wanted comfort, but she stayed, sitting there in silence, drinking tea with him, watching the Manhattan sunset fade beyond the glass. And sometimes silent presence is all a lonely person truly needs. The call came at 11 at night, just as Vivian finished her shift at Serafino's and was about to catch the subway back to the Bronx. The voice on the other end as concise as ever, telling her that Mr. Moretti wanted to see her and that a car was waiting at the rear entrance of the restaurant. And Vivian did not ask why, did not ask what had happened, simply slipped the phone into her pocket and stepped outside to where the familiar black Mercedes was waiting. 30 minutes later, she stood before the door to Alexander's office on the top floor of Moretti Tower, wondering what could be so urgent it could not wait until morning. And when she pushed the door open, the first thing she noticed was how much darker the room was than usual, lit only by a small desk lamp and the flickering fire in the corner fireplace. Alexander sat in a leather armchair near the flames, instead of behind his desk, a whiskey bottle already half empty on the side table. The glass in his hand nearly drained, and he was not wearing a suit. The first time Vivian had seen him in nothing but a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened, his hair slightly undone, no longer perfectly slicked back, looking tired, looking human. "Sit down," he said without looking at her, his eyes fixed on the dancing fire, adding that there was another bottle on the shelf if she wanted one. Vivian moved to the armchair opposite him and sat, declining the drink, saying quietly that he had not summoned her at midnight just to drink. And Alexander gave a short, low laugh that held no real humor, replying that no, that was not why, then falling silent for a long moment, his gray eyes still searching the flames as if they held answers. "Today is my father's death anniversary," he said at last. Vivian said nothing, simply stayed where she was, understanding that he needed to be heard more than answered. 15 years ago, Alexander continued, his voice distant and heavy, he was betrayed by the man he trusted most. A business partner of 20 years, someone he considered a brother. 3 bullets to the chest in this very office, right in front of me, and I was 21. A chill ran down Vivian's spine despite the warmth of the fire as she imagined a young man witnessing his father's murder, and she asked softly what he had done. "I killed him," Alexander replied without emotion, as if describing the weather. "With my bare hands." He still had 3 bullets in the gun, but never fired another shot. "It was the first time I killed someone, and from that moment on, I never trusted anyone again." The fire crackled softly, shadows leaping across the walls, and Vivian looked at the man opposite her, the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast, and for the first time she saw a fracture in the armor he had worn for 15 years. "Mr. Moretti," she said after a while, "I do not know what to say, to make you feel better. I am not good at comforting people, but I know what it feels like to lose your parents, and I know that kind of pain never truly goes away. It just becomes part of you, like a scar you learn to live with." Alexander turned to her then, his eyes finally leaving the fire, the flames reflected in his gray gaze making them look warmer, more human. "When did you lose your parents?" he asked. "When I was 16, Vivian answered. "A car accident. They were coming to pick me up from school when a truck ran a red light. My father died on the spot. My mother lived 2 more weeks in the hospital before she followed him, and after that I had to raise my 2 siblings on my own." Silence settled between them, but it was the silence of 2 people sharing a wound without needing words. And Vivian understood then why Alexander had called her tonight, not for work, not because he needed something done, but because on the anniversary of his father's death he did not want to be alone, and out of all the people around him, his subordinates, his partners, his distant fiancée, he had chosen to call her, a waitress from the Bronx he had known only a few weeks. "Do you know what that means?" Alexander asked quietly, almost in a whisper. "This is the first time in 15 years I have told this story to anyone." Vivian looked at him, powerful, wealthy, ruthless, and utterly alone, and said that it meant he trusted her, or that he was very drunk. And Alexander laughed, a real laugh, the first she had ever heard from him, making him seem younger, less frightening, less remote, admitting that it was probably both, then setting his glass down and looking at her with eyes that had lost some of their usual coldness, saying that whatever the reason, he was glad she was there tonight. Holloway. Vivian did not answer aloud. She simply nodded and stayed, sitting with him by the fire, two strangers from different worlds, sharing a small pocket of understanding, while outside the windows Manhattan blazed with light, as if the city never slept, and inside that room time seemed to pause, and Vivian realized that something had shifted between them that night, something she was not yet ready to name. While Vivian sat by the fire with Alexander in Moretti Tower, 10 miles south in Manhattan, another meeting was unfolding in a hidden basement beneath an old warehouse in Brooklyn's industrial district, where Serena Ashford stood before a whiteboard covered in photographs, diagrams, and red connecting lines like a battlefield map, her platinum blonde hair pulled tightly back, pale blue eyes glittering with cruelty and the hunger for revenge, while Vincent Castellano lounged in a leather chair in the corner, a half-burned Cuban cigar in his hand, smoke curling around his scarred face like a veil of shadow, and beside him stood 2 armed bodyguards and Theodore Grant, the manager of Serafino's, trembling like a leaf in the wind, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cellar cold that felt like winter. "The plan is ready," Serena said, her voice sharp as a blade. "The Holloway girl will be the perfect bait. Alexander trusts her. That much is obvious from the fact that he has used her for 4 consecutive missions and even summoned her to his office at night." Castellano drew on his cigar, smoke streaming from his nostrils like a thinking dragon, and asked whether she was certain the false information would lead Moretti exactly where they wanted him. "Absolutely," Serena replied, turning to Theodore, her eyes narrowing like a cat studying a mouse. "Theodore, tell Mr. Castellano about the upcoming meeting Alexander is preparing." Theodore swallowed hard, his throat dry and gritty as sand, knowing that if Alexander ever uncovered this betrayal, death would be the kindest outcome he could hope for. Yet a gambling debt from 10 years earlier to Castellano still hung over his head, and Castellano had made it clear that if Theodore did not cooperate, his sister in New Jersey would suffer the consequences. "There is a major meeting next Saturday," Theodore said, his voice shaking. "At St. Mark's Club, Alexander will meet with several Russian partners to discuss a new shipping route through the Newark port. It is the most important meeting of the year. Very few people know about it, only Alexander, Nikolai, and me, because I am responsible for reserving the private room." Castellano smiled like a fox spotting a plump hen, and asked what role the Holloway girl would play. Serena pulled Vivian's photograph from the board and stared at the face of the girl who had humiliated her with undisguised hatred, saying that the girl would act as the courier for this meeting, that Theodore would ensure the information reached her by accident, making her believe she had uncovered something important, but that the information would be false, leading Alexander to a different location where they would already be waiting. "And what about Daniel Mercer?" Castellano asked. "Is the accountant ready?" Serena nodded, a half-smile curving her lips, explaining that Daniel Mercer had been Alexander's chief accountant for 15 years and knew every financial secret of the Moretti empire, that over the past 6 months Serena had cultivated him, discovered his wife was having an affair with a young personal trainer, and used that knowledge to manipulate him, that Daniel believed he was working with Castellano to take revenge on his wife and secure money to flee, unaware that he was merely a disposable pawn who would bear all blame when everything collapsed. "Mercer transferred Alexander's offshore asset list to me last week," Serena said. "And more importantly, he will be at St. Mark's Club that night, as a witness to the trap. When everything goes down, Alexander will believe Mercer was the only mole, and suspicion will never fall on me." Castellano rose, stepped beside Serena, and placed a hand on her shoulder in a gesture both intimate and threatening, telling her she had done well, and that when it was over she would have Serafino's, 1/3 of the Eastern Territory, and freedom from Alexander Moretti. Serena looked up at him, pale blue eyes flashing with ambition and hatred, saying she did not only want freedom, she wanted to see Alexander's face when he realized the woman he was about to marry had betrayed him from the very beginning, and she wanted the little waitress to pay for daring to steal his attention. That night, when Vivian left Moretti Tower after her quiet conversation by the fire with Alexander, she did not know that a message had already been sent to Theodore Grant. "Prepare the leak. The plan begins in 48 hours." The trap was set, and Vivian Holloway, The waitress from the Bronx with fearless eyes was walking straight into it without knowing a thing. 2 days after the night by the fireplace, Vivian received word of the meeting at St. Mark's Club in a way that immediately made her feel something was wrong. When Theodore Grant called her into his office at Serafino's after closing hours and claimed he had accidentally left an important file on his desk and needed her to help deliver it to Moretti Tower the next morning, and as Vivian lifted the folder, a sheet of paper slipped out as if deliberately tucked in too loosely, detailing Alexander's meeting with Russian partners on Saturday, the location, the time, the number of attendees, even the password to access the private room, and Theodore feigned panic as he hurriedly picked it up, warning her that it was classified information she must not tell anyone about before quickly ushering her out of the office. But Vivian had lived long enough in a world steeped in deception to recognize the scent of a trap, because information that sensitive was never kept in an ordinary folder. And Theodore Grant, a man so meticulous he bordered on paranoid, never accidentally forgot anything. That night, instead of taking the subway back to the Bronx as usual, Vivian slipped into the shadows of the alley across from Serafino's and waited, applying everything Nikolai had taught her, blending into darkness, controlling her breathing, observing without being seen. And close to midnight she saw Theodore sneak out the back door of the restaurant, head lowered, coat collar pulled high to conceal his face, not calling a taxi, not heading for the main street, but slipping through dark alleys like a man fleeing something unseen. Vivian followed, keeping just enough distance to avoid detection while staying close enough not to lose him, through a maze of Lower East Side alleys, until he stopped in front of a small rundown bar with a flickering neon sign, glanced around, then went inside. Vivian waited 3 minutes, then circled behind the bar where she found a small, cracked window leading into a storage area, climbed onto a dumpster, pressed her eye to the opening, and what she saw froze the blood in her veins. Theodore sat across from a man she recognized instantly from the photographs in Alexander's files. Vincent Castellano, the Mafia boss who controlled southern Manhattan and the sworn enemy of the Moretti family, and standing beside him in a tight black dress, with that familiar platinum blonde hair, was Serena Ashford. Vivian held her breath and pressed her ear to the narrow opening to listen, as Serena's voice rang out, cold and smug, saying that everything was ready, that the waitress had received the false information, that if she reported it to Alexander, he would adjust his plans accordingly and walk straight into the trap, and if she did not report it, they still had Theodore to ensure the information reached the right ears. "And if everything goes as planned?" Castellano asked through cigar smoke. Serena replied with a smile as venomous as a snake's bite, that Alexander Moretti would be caught in the act during an illegal arms deal, that she had arranged for an anonymous tip to reach the FBI about the meeting, that federal agents would raid the scene, Alexander would be arrested, and the Moretti empire would collapse, while Mercer would take the fall as the traitor. Theodore's voice trembled as he asked whether he would be safe, and Castellano's dry laugh scraped the air as he told him he would be safe when Castellano said he was, ordering him to go home and not do anything stupid. Vivian slipped away from her vantage point, her heart pounding like a war drum, running through dark alleys until she reached a public phone 6 blocks away. Yet she did not call Alexander. Not yet, because she needed proof, something more solid than the testimony of a waitress he might or might not believe. Over the next 2 days, Vivian shadowed Serena like a ghost, knowing her routine from overheard conversations at Serafino's, the spa on Tuesdays, lunches with socialite friends on Wednesdays, shopping along Fifth Avenue on Thursdays, and on Thursday, while Serena tried on clothes in a fitting room at Bergdorf Goodman, Vivian slipped into the waiting limousine outside, its door carelessly left unlocked by the driver. In a hidden drawer beneath the rear seat, she found the burner phone Serena used to communicate with Castellano, and Vivian photographed every message, every call log, every piece of evidence documenting 6 months of betrayal and conspiracy to destroy Alexander Moretti. When she slipped out of the car just 3 minutes before Serena returned, her own phone clenched tight in her hand and filled with proof, Vivian Holloway knew she was holding something that could save lives or destroy them. She could stay silent, complete her assignment, take the money, and disappear as she had once planned, or she could tell Alexander the truth and face whatever came next. She thought of Marcus waiting for surgery, of Lily waiting for her to come home each night, but she also thought of Alexander sitting alone by the fire on the anniversary of his father's death, a man who had lost everything to betrayal and was about to lose it again if she did nothing. Vivian Holloway had made her decision long ago. She simply had not been ready to admit it, and she took out her phone and called Nikolai, telling him she needed to see Mr. Moretti immediately, that it was urgent. 30 minutes after the call, Vivian stood inside Alexander's office at Moretti Tower, her phone filled with evidence resting on the desk between them. And she told him everything, from the way Theodore had dropped the false information far too deliberately, to the secret meeting in the rundown bar, to the messages exchanged between Serena and Castellano over the past 6 months. Alexander sat in silence as she spoke, his face carved from stone, not a single muscle moving, storm-gray eyes fixed on her without blinking, and when she finished, the silence stretched so long she could hear the wall clock ticking. Then, Alexander reached out, took the phone, and began scrolling through each message, each photograph, each proof of betrayal by the woman he was supposed to marry, his face remaining expressionless, yet Vivian noticed his fingers tightening around the phone until his knuckles turned white. He spoke at last, his voice low and distant like thunder rolling far away, saying that he had suspected Serena 3 months earlier, after discovering irregularities in the financial reports, but he had no proof and had been waiting for her to expose herself. Vivian asked why he had not acted sooner, and Alexander replied that he wanted to see how far she would go, and because he wanted to know who would truly stand by him when everything collapsed, adding quietly that now he knew. Vivian said nothing, because she had not acted out of loyalty or affection, only because she could not watch a man walk into a trap that mirrored the betrayal that had killed his father 15 years earlier, though she did not say that aloud. Instead, she asked what he would do now, and Alexander answered that he would walk into the trap, stopping her protest with a raised hand, but on his own terms, not theirs. He stood and moved to the window overlooking Manhattan at night, his back straight as a drawn blade, explaining that Castellano wanted the Federal Bureau of Investigation to raid the meeting, meaning he would not strike directly but would use the law as a weapon, unaware that Alexander had someone inside the bureau and would ensure the raid never happened. When Vivian asked about Serena and Theodore, Alexander turned back with a smile cold as ice, saying Serena would be at St. Mark's Club that night because she would want to witness his fall with her own eyes, and that would be the greatest mistake of her life, while Theodore would be dealt with later, a mere pawn not worth distraction. When Vivian mentioned Daniel Mercer, recalling the name from the secret meeting, Alexander confirmed it with a flicker of disappointment, remarking that 15 years of loyalty had been sold for a grievance against a wife. Yet Mercer would still be useful, believing everything was unfolding as planned, and that confidence would make him careless. Alexander spread a map of St. Mark's Club across the desk, and pointed out positions as he spoke, where Nikolai's men would be placed, explaining that when Castellano appeared, and he would because he never missed the chance to watch an enemy fall, the trap would close, and Serena, Castellano, and all their collaborators would be caught in the act. Vivian asked calmly what her role would be that night, and Alexander studied her with eyes weighing a final decision before saying she would be the courier just as they expected, that she would go to St. Mark's Club carrying the false documents Theodore had prepared, and behave as though she knew nothing of the plot, her presence reassuring Serena and Castellano that everything was proceeding smoothly, and when the trap snapped shut, she would say, "Seaside," not out of fear this time, but because it would mark the moment they struck back. Vivian looked down at the map, at the marked positions, at the trap being prepared for those who had tried to trap first, and she understood that on Saturday night everything would change, that some would fall and some would rise, and that Vivian Holloway, the waitress from the Bronx, would stand at the center of it all, as a piece on the board that had chosen to rewrite the game itself. St. Mark's Club sat atop an old building on the Upper West Side, its rooftop overlooking all of Manhattan at night, the city lights flickering below like a galaxy spilled at their feet, and Vivian stepped inside at 9 o'clock on Saturday evening, with the black leather briefcase in her hand, wearing a sleek black dress that hugged her figure, her face calm as if she had no idea she was walking into the center of a war about to explode. While Alexander was already seated in the VIP booth, Nikolai standing behind him like a living shadow, and across the terrace Daniel Mercer sat alone with a trembling glass in his hand, sweat beading on his forehead despite the blasting air conditioning, everything appearing like an ordinary meeting, yet Vivian could feel the electricity in the air, an invisible tension coiling like a storm waiting to break. 15 minutes later, Vincent Castellano arrived, stepping onto the rooftop surrounded by 4 bodyguards, his scarred face wearing a smug smile as if he had already won before the fight began, and right behind him, Serena Ashford emerged from the shadows in a blood-red gown with her platinum blonde hair swept up, no longer pretending, walking straight to Castellano's side and standing beside him like a public declaration of betrayal. Alexander showed no surprise, merely sitting there with a glass of whiskey in hand, storm-gray eyes fixed coldly on the woman he had once intended to marry. greeting her calmly and remarking that her dress was beautiful, the color of betrayal, prompting Serena to laugh, the sound sharp and brittle like shattering crystal, replying that he had always known how to compliment women, but tonight was not about fashion. Tonight was the night he would lose everything. Castellano stepped forward, raising a hand to signal his guards to draw their weapons. 4 guns snapping up aimed at Alexander and Nikolai, as Castellano declared the game over, boasting that the Federal Bureau of Investigation would arrive in 15 minutes, and that before that he wanted to hear Alexander beg for his life the way his father had begged before dying, while Vivian stood at the edge of the room, heart pounding like a drum, yet her face composed, watching Alexander for a signal that did not come, because Alexander was looking straight at Castellano, as he said evenly that the FBI would not be coming, that he had cut off Castellano's call 3 days earlier, and that no one knew about the meeting except those in the room. Castellano's smile froze. Serena's face drained of color as confidence cracked for the first time, whispering that it was impossible because she had made the call herself, to which Alexander replied coldly, asking who she thought she had called. Agent Morrison, the man she believed was an FBI mole but who had in fact been Alexander's asset for 10 years, causing Serena to stumble back, pale blue eyes wide with horror, while Castellano roared in rage and ordered his guards to fire, only for Alexander to speak a single word: seaside. The lights went out instantly, and the rooftop plunged into absolute darkness as chaos erupted. Screams, furniture crashing, frantic footsteps, Vivian hearing gunshots. 1, then 2, followed by someone's cry of pain, instinctively dropping flat to the floor with her heart hammering in the dark, fingers gripping the leg of a table, then hearing Nikolai, the dry sounds of controlled violence, fists landing, bones breaking, bodies hitting the floor as he moved through the darkness like a deathly phantom, systematically and brutally dismantling Castellano's guards. 30 seconds later, the lights came back on and the rooftop looked like a battlefield. The 4 bodyguards lying motionless on the ground, some groaning, some utterly still, Castellano kneeling in the center with his shoulder soaked in blood from a gunshot wound, his face ashen with pain and fear, Serena restrained by Nikolai with his arm locked around her neck and the muzzle of his gun pressed to her temple, and Daniel Mercer shaking in the corner, sobbing like a child with tears and mucus streaking his face as he begged Alexander not to kill him, promising to confess everything, shrieking that Serena had not only betrayed him with Castellano, but had also contacted a journalist, Robert Sterling of the New York Times, that she had a safe deposit box at the Centurion private vault, containing evidence of all of Alexander's money laundering over the past 10 years, that she planned to sell the exclusive story after Alexander was arrested. The rooftop fell into absolute silence as Alexander looked at Serena, and for the first time that night, something other than coldness appeared in his gray eyes, the profound disappointment of a man betrayed to the bone, murmuring that a journalist meant she had not only wanted to overthrow him, but to destroy him completely. Serena offering no reply, meeting his gaze with pure hatred even as her throat was constricted, showing no remorse and no plea, while Vivian rose from where she had taken cover and looked at the devastation around her, realizing that the night was not yet over, that the secrets inside that safe deposit box, the evidence Serena had gathered for years, remained a lethal threat to Alexander Moretti, and somehow Vivian knew that she would be the one tasked with dealing with it. Alexander Moretti stood at the center of the rooftop at St. Mark's Club, like a king delivering judgment upon traitors, surrounded by the wreckage of a failed conspiracy, Castellano's guards lying motionless across the marble floor, blood spreading over the stone like abstract paintings of violence. And he stepped in front of Vincent Castellano, the man kneeling with a blood-soaked shoulder and a face drained of color by pain, telling him in a voice cold as ice that he would live, but his empire ended tonight, that every inch of southern Manhattan now belonged to Moretti, and that if Castellano showed his face in the city after 48 hours, Nikolai would finish what had begun, Castellano offering no protest, only a weak nod as the last traces of arrogance were crushed beneath reality, before Nikolai's men hauled him away like a sack of refuse. Alexander then turned to Theodore Grant, the trembling manager pressed into a corner, his face white as paper, and told him without emotion that 22 years of service were the only reason he still breathed, ordering him to disappear from the city forever, and warning that if his name was ever whispered again, he would wish he had died that night. Theodore stammering a useless thank you before fleeing like a rat from a trap. Daniel Mercer was spared because of the information he had provided about Serena and the safe deposit box, but he was exiled from the city for life, carrying the shame of a traitor allowed to live. Finally, Alexander stood before Serena Ashford, still restrained by Nikolai, pale blue eyes burning with hatred, no tears, no pleas, no remorse, even as every plan she had built collapsed to dust. And Alexander told her she would be confined to the northern estate, not out of lingering affection but because killing her would create complications with her family in Boston, warning her that any attempt to escape or contact anyone would end with her vanishing without a trace. Serena hissed that he would regret choosing a waitress over her, but Alexander did not answer, merely signaling for her removal, and when she was gone he stood alone amid the ruined rooftop looking out over the glittering city before turning to Vivian, who had remained silent throughout, observing with a calm expression as though witnessing a play rather than the collapse of a plot that could have killed her. Alexander stepped toward her, gray eyes holding a respect she had never seen before, and told her she had saved him that night, that she could have taken the money and disappeared, but chose the truth, asking why, and Vivian answered simply that 15 years ago, he had lost his father to betrayal, and she could not watch it happen again without acting. After a long silence, Alexander removed a small silver key on a delicate chain and placed it in her palm, telling her it was Serena's safe deposit box at the Centurion private vault on Fifth Avenue, and instructing her to retrieve everything inside without opening or reading it. Vivian feeling the weight of trust heavier than metal, understanding this was absolute faith, the kind Alexander had given no one since his father died, and when she asked what would happen if she opened it, he replied that he would be disappointed, though he did not believe she would, because she had proven she kept her word. Vivian closed her fingers around the key, nodded once, and walked away through silent corridors into the cold Manhattan night, pausing to look at the key beneath the city lights, and realizing that 3 weeks earlier she had been an exhausted waitress from the Bronx working 3 jobs to survive, and now she held a secret capable of destroying the largest mafia empire on the East Coast, knowing she could trade it for freedom and a new life or remain loyal and bind her future to Alexander's world, smiling softly as she walked toward the subway, because she already knew her choice, even if she was not ready to admit why. And so Vivian Holloway, the humble waitress from Serafino's, walked out of a night filled with gunfire, betrayal, and blood, gripping the key to the city's darkest secret, while Alexander Moretti, the most feared mafia boss in New York, placed his trust not in his powerful fiancée, but in the woman who had shown quiet courage under unbearable pressure, granting her not only her life but real power, reminding us that true worth is not measured by origin or status, but by how one stands when life tries to break them. That sometimes the greatest strength is not striking back but standing upright after being knocked down. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel so you do not miss more deeply moving stories like this. A like and share from you helps us continue creating meaningful content every day. Tell us how Vivian's story made you feel, and whether you have ever faced a moment when you had to stand alone against the world. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to hear from your heart, and we wish all of you watching good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.